So in this video, I'm really excited to discuss a topic with you called arrested development. And we're specifically going to discuss how this affects the anxious preoccupied attachment style. Now, if you're not already familiar with the anxious preoccupied attachment style, it's one of four major love styles or ways in which that we learn to love and connect with others. And this style tends to be the one that sometimes feels really afraid of abandonment in relationships, kind of fears being alone. Sometimes will be very codependent, well, almost always very codependent, and often jumping from relationship to relationship. And they sometimes, when they're triggered, can be very clingy or needy because they're having a trauma response and they're trying to essentially cope with that by maintaining proximity to people that they love or care for in their lives. So, the anxious preoccupied attachment style, the topic for today, is really understanding what arrested development is. And here's the crazy part about it. Anxious preoccupieds struggle with arrested development quite significantly in these specific places. And, when we look at what arrested development is, you can think of this idea of the body grows up, but the mind does not. Now, this is not me saying that this is this overarching theme for all aspects of the anxious preoccupied's life, because it's not. It's just a lot more nuanced than that. But arrested development essentially takes place when we have trauma and we form this kind of like immediate coping mechanism around it. And you can think of that coping mechanism as acting like a hard outer shell that doesn't allow us to grow. So let's take a look at this, for example. First of all, arrested development for the anxious preoccupied starts to occur when they learn this coping mechanism of trying to stay really close to their partner or loved one. And wherever we are growing, or sorry, wherever we are coping, we are not growing. Because when we're an immediate coping mechanism, think of like the coping mechanisms we see across society, people struggling with anger. It's like that's a knee-jerk reaction. They don't consciously think about being angry and then decide to choose an unhealthy expression of anger. It just comes automatically. Or when people flee, right? They have a flight response. They leave the scene. They're not like, oh, I think I should leave the situation now. They're having a flight response the vast majority of the time. When people go into freeze mode, right? So many different places where we are coping, there's no like self observation happening. And part of the four ingredients required for growth are to first self observe or introspect, then to realize what the problem is, or to realize that we have a pattern, then to go underneath it and take accountability for a root cause strategy to create change, and then to be able to practice that strategy until it becomes our new normal, until it's really wired into our subconscious. So think of experiences, right? And we'll look at the anxious preoccupied specifically, where you have felt like you have this automatic coping mechanism. And here's the key part of arrested development. Arrested development, when it's taking place for us and we're expressing our arrested development coping mechanisms, it actually feels like you are childlike. So I'll share this story with you for a moment. So when I was a little kid, I was super afraid of the dark, like super afraid of the dark. I was certain that like there were monsters in my closet and under my bed and all these different things when I was really young. And I had this experience, like, I want to say like 8 years ago now, maybe. And I went to sleep. And so this is me as an adult, right? I went to sleep, and my now husband, who I was just dating at the time when we were living together, said, oh, I have to stay up and do some work, and I'm going to come to bed at 12 o'clock. And for me, I had early client sessions in the morning. I was busy running my practice at the time. And he said, okay, I'll come to bed in like a couple hours. And I had to get up really early. So I went to bed and I woke up, and it had been like longer than he said before he would be coming to sleep. Like, I think he said, oh, I'll come to bed at 12, and it was like 12:30, and I woke up and knew he was in the house. Like, I knew he was in the other room. But I felt such like extremely strong emotions, like so much, like I felt like an 8 out of 10 of like just strongly charged emotions. And I looked and I saw it was 12:30, and it was like a Tuesday night. It's not like I thought that he was like leaving the house or doing anything. Like, we were in a really good place in our relationship. He was super trustworthy and stable. And um and I was like, what are my emotions? Like, this is not about, like, I could consciously sort of observe them and realize this was not about what's happening right now. It's not about that he hasn't come to bed 30 minutes after he said. And it was so interesting for me because I was like observing this experience going, I have all this strong emotion. What's going on here? Now, the emotions I felt first biggest one that was the strongest was like sheer panic, like absolute panic, fear, like I was frozen. Um, and the next emotions I felt were like betrayal, like I felt very betrayed. And then I felt like abandoned and kind of like, again, like most so afraid, like fear and betrayal were the biggest ones and kind of this small sense of abandonment. And so I'm sitting there going like, well, I'm actually laying there and I felt frozen. Like I felt like, oh, I'm not going to move. Like I felt too afraid to move. And this was very quick. Like this wasn't like this extended period of time. This is all happening like probably within like 15 to 30 seconds. And I like witnessed the emotions and I went, okay, this is there's no way I'm feeling this triggered like about this event that he's in the other room and hasn't come to bed yet. And I know he has work that he had to stay up late to do. Like, what is this possibly about? And I closed my eyes and I was like, what other memories do I have of feeling this way? And all of a sudden, this like series of memories came back or when I was a child, because I was so afraid to go to bed, my parents would often like take turns and say, "Oh, don't worry, we're going to sleep with you tonight." And they would tell me that they were going to sleep with me and that I didn't have to worry. And they would you stay the night. So I would go into my bed and go to sleep because I would like fight going to bed as a kid because I was so scared of the dark. And then what would happen is once I fell asleep, they would leave and go to bed in their room. And I would wake up every night when this happened, and I would realize that my parent was gone, and I would feel like, first of all, fear, right? Like this extreme panic, like just frozen in my bed. And like I don't know if you listening to this have ever been a child and felt so afraid of something and you just feel like you can't move in your bed, you feel like frozen. And that was like this experience I was having. And then I would feel betrayed because I would feel like, oh, they said that they were going to come, stay sleeping here and they didn't. And I realized that I had this like ongoing series of those events. Now, like objectively, from an adult point of view, like that was not a significant trauma. That was a very small thing, but it happened repetitively. And it's like the repetition and emotion that can really create those programs. And so I had this moment of as an adult having these like memories and these feelings come up because something similar was happening in my adult life that catalyzed the memory because you have to understand your subconscious mind stores all of your memories, right? It consolidates them a little bit, but it stores them. And so when something is pushed on that's familiar, your subconscious mind will push up, and that's what a trigger really is. It will push up all associated feelings from past experiences. So this in that moment for me was a version of arrested development because there I was having this like exaggerated freeze response and fear, which I was not a fearful adult. I was a fearful kid for sure, but definitely not a fearful adult. And I was having this like extreme fear response, laying in the bed, like feeling frozen and so afraid. And I was like, wow, this is so interesting. So, anyways, then I use the tools that I know to equilibrate the story like, hey, I'm fully safe, reassure myself that I'm safe. And here's all the reasons why, because the why lands with the subconscious. If you've ever listened to any of the reprogramming videos I have on here, and then find a way to meet my needs, right? So I went into the other room and I asked my husband, my husband now, but then boyfriend, for a hug and told him the story and kind of we had a laugh about it and he was really kind and I moved through that experience. Now I tell you this whole story because it applies to the anxious preoccupied. It actually applies to all insecure attachment styles and we don't have one version of this, right? My arrested development coping mechanism there was this like extreme or freeze response. But we have tons of this as anxious attachment styles, right? I was a fearful avoidant, but I had the anxious side. But you can see this dynamic. And so think of what arrested development feels like. Okay. So think of it. A part of you doesn't grow up in an experience because you formed this shell around how to cope with it. And then you never got to evolve through that experience. That's what arrested development is. Well, think of what arrested development feels like. Here are some of the actual symptoms of it. Feeling childlike, feeling very afraid, behavioral coping mechanisms that are childlike, behavioral coping mechanisms that you're reusing that you developed as a child and haven't changed or broken through yet, feeling like it's difficult to control your emotions, having impulse control issues can be a version of it, having like adult temper tantrums can be a version of it as well. And like think of young children. Now, think of anxious preoccupieds. Where are anxious preoccupieds struggling with arrested development? They're struggling with it when they fear abandonment. As children, they develop this way, this strategy of trying to survive that experience of feeling this fear of abandonment by holding on tight, by clinging, by trying to um, maintain proximity to their caregivers as much as possible and trying to like find a way to attach more deeply. And this is the part of them that they haven't grown through yet and learn to soothe through. And so, you know, how earlier I mentioned wherever we have a coping mechanism that's automatic, we don't grow at the same time. We can't grow and be self protecting at the same time. It's not possible. And so, because they have this automatic coping mechanism of trying to go directly to getting closer and closer to their caregivers as much as they can, well, then essentially what takes place is they're in this arrested development state when it comes to fearing being abandoned, fearing being unsafe, or being alone. And so until those root cause challenges are worked through, and by the way, if you're like, oh, this is interesting, I relate to this, I have a whole webinar style course inside the personal development school that has slides, everything. It's about an hour and a half long. You can for sure break through like using the tools. They're super result oriented to work through these things in like the hour and a half. Like you'll have a couple exercises, the tools, very straightforward. And there's ways to like move through these panicked behaviors when you understand them from this subconscious perspective and how they're affecting us. And a big part of it at a high level is like we have to give to ourselves what we couldn't get, right? What wasn't available to us in childhood, we have to learn to give to ourselves. And that's a big part of self regulation. There's a little more to it than that, but that's like a really good place to start. And when we can move through those coping mechanisms, we actually are able to feel regulated, feel at peace instead of going into those automatic and intensive mechanisms of coping that, when you look, by the way, have really strong downsides. Like think of the arrested development coping mechanisms and how they usually get you exactly more of what you don't want. They go in like a vicious cycle. So, for example, you know, anxious preoccupied cling and they hold on tight, but sometimes people then feel suffocated or overwhelmed, or they push away, or they fear losing their sense of self, or they feel like their boundaries aren't heard. And then it causes more space. And then the AP, you know, feels the need to cling more and hold on tighter. And it just becomes this vicious cycle. So, you know, again, I have this whole thing you can go into, hour and a half, have a major breakthrough, and it's free for 7 days. And you'll be able to get through it in 7 days for sure. Like you can sit down and just do it in a sitting. So the link to that is down below, but I really want you to see here how arrested development has these sorts of impacts, and also understand where it's coming from. It's coming from you develop these coping mechanisms as a child. And now, because you have constantly been in the state of coping when these fears are triggered, where we are coping, we are not evolving. And so by being able to self-observe, witness, understand this, and then actually go into root cause and develop those really powerful new healthy coping mechanisms, that's how we see a breakthrough in this experience. So I hope this makes sense. It's such an interesting topic. I'm doing a version of this for all the different attachment styles, and you can look out too, like I'll do one for the dismissive avoidant and fearful avoidant and the Peter Pan syndrome idea. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. If you're not already subscribed to this channel and you want to stay tuned for the rest of this series and not miss the other arrested development videos on here, or just explore other things about the subconscious mind, attachment theory in general, then I would love for you to subscribe, and I'll see you every single day because I put daily YouTube videos out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and see you soon.